Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and in this video I'll briefly explain another postcolonial concept called Metonymic Gap. Now, of course, you already understand what metonymy is, and I will first read briefly the definition as given by the editors of Postcolonial Key Concepts and then elaborate it a little more. So what they're saying is this is a term for what is arguably the most subtle form of abrogation. Now you already, if you watched my video on abrogation, you already know that abrogation is when the native writers or even native speakers tend to overwrite the codes of colonial languages and cultures by inserting new modes of expression and writing into the colonial language, right? The metonymic gap is that cultural gap formed when appropriations of a colonial language insert unglossed words, phrases, or passages from a first language, or concepts, allusions, or references that may be unknown to the reader. Let's say if I'm writing in English, these are things unknown to the English reader. Such words become synecdochic of the writer's culture, the part that stands for the whole rather than representations of the word, as the colonial language might. Thus, the inserted language stands for the colonized culture in a metonymic way, and its very resistance to interpretation constructs a gap between the writer's culture and the colonial culture. The local writer is thus able to represent his or her word to the colonizers and others in the metropolitan language, and at the same time to signal and emphasize a difference from it. In effect, the writer is saying, I'm using your language so that you will understand my word, but you will also know by the difference in the way I use it that you cannot share my experience. So metonymic gap then implies certain things. It's a native writer using the language of the colonizer, writing in French, writing in English, but infusing that writing with local mythologies, local vocabularies, unglossed words, cultural and historical allusions, right? Now, what it does is it layers the text, right? So the French reader or an English reader from England or United States may pick up a book, let's say by Salman Rushdie, right? And they can read the surface language of it, but in the process of reading it, they are also internalizing this idea that this is different kind of language. So that's one impact, right? But the bigger gap is the second stage, where the allusions and everything else that's incorporated in everyday speech in that language are not accessible unless that reader be highly curious about other cultures. So I always use this example from the opening lines of the Satanic Verses, right? Because I teach it as a banned book course. So in the opening lines, as the two characters are falling from the sky, right? One of them is singing a song, right? And at the end of it is a refrain which he uses, hoji, hoji, right? Now that's a metonymic gap, because any English reader who is not privy to Bollywood culture, and that to 60s Bollywood culture, would not get that hoji in that sentence, right, actually was used as a refrain in 1960s Bollywood songs, right? For example, if you speak Urdu or Hindi, the famous song Hawa Mein Udta Jaye Mera Lal Dupatta Malmal Ka Hoji, Hoji, right? Now that's a metonymic gap, because a metropolitan reader will have no reason to have access to that. Now think what is at stake here then in this kind of writing. Why does it become radical? I mean, you can see it in Ngugi Thiong'o's work, where he inserts Gikuyu songs, even in translation, but they are layered, right? And a simple English reader will not be able to read that subtlety into it, right? So what's at stake then is a challenge, right? What kind of a challenge? A challenge like, for example, you, me, and everyone else who gets a degree in English literature, PhD, master's. We don't just learn the language. We learn the metaphors, the allusions, the culture within which those words mean something. For example, I teach literature at an American university. I can't simply do that if I only know English. I have to learn the meaning-making processes, the history, the culture within which those works are produced. Now, metonymic gap in post-colonial writing then forces the metropolitan reader to acknowledge that in order to get through an African novel, a West African novel, a Kenyan novel, or an Indian novel, they can't just do it imperially simply because it's their language. They will have to perform a layered reading of it and fill that gap, right? So that's the kind of challenge these novels pose. As a concept then in post-colonial studies, we can employ it to read any novels, right? Written by people like Ngugi Thiong'o, even the most well-known novel, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, right? If you do not know the proverbs or their local connotation within the text, you will miss certain things even though the language is English. And it applies even more deeply to translation. Like anytime someone translates a ghazal of Ghalib, right, into English, I'm reading it and I'm realizing there is such a vast gap, metonymic gap, which just simply an act of translation cannot fill. But even when you're reading an original work written in English or French by a native author, right, what they infuse the language with, right, produces that metonymic gap. Now, if you have read your Ngugi Thiong'o, you already know that he describes 3 stages of native cultural production, right? The first stage, when he talks about, he says that the natives try to write like their colonial masters because the aim is to prove to their masters that they can master their language and write like them. The second stage is when the writers go and discover their own native materials, languages, myths, right, history, and start incorporating it in their own writing. And the third stage, of course, is revolutionary writing, when they, I think in Fanon's words, right, express the heart of the people, when they start writing with the people. So both Fanon and Ngugi Thiong'o describe these 3 stages of cultural production. So overall then, to sum up, metonymic gap is when native writers write in the language of colonizers, but infuse that writing with unglossed words without giving a reference, with allusions that are native, that are local, and that an average reader from the metropolitan will have no access to, and it gives their work a kind of complexity, which becomes challenging for any reader from the metropolitan cultures who is not an expert, and then it forces them to go beyond the language and see what's behind it. That's all I have. I hope this was useful. As always, if you have any questions, please send them my way and post them in the comments. And if you have not already subscribed to the channel, please do so that you stay updated about whenever I upload a new video. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time. Until then, peace and love.